Welcome to this chess video, everyone. So here in this one, we are actually going to be discussing why doubled pawns are not necessarily bad. A lot of people think doubled pawns are automatically bad and they should be avoided at all costs. This is not the case, and in many situations you actually want doubled pawns. I want doubled pawns, and I don't think most players do, so this video is going to help explain why that is. So first example here is actually from a few years ago, one of my chess.com games from I think about 3 years ago. And back then, I used to play e4, e5. So e4, e5 it is. Our opponent continues knight f3. I play knight to c6. And so far, this is pretty common. Everyone has probably seen this many times before. This game, we go bishop c4. We have an Italian game that we are facing. Play knight to f6. Pretty common stuff so far. And now d3, which is a little bit slower. Maybe we'll get to some kind of Giuoco piano game. Maybe we'll get some kind of slower Italian. More positional stuff. Things might not develop immediately. So I play bishop to c5, and now with bishop c5, we do transpose the Giuoco piano game, and what this actually is very quiet, and quiet meaning positional. So Giuoco piano, and specifically the Giuoco pianissimo, that's the same wording that they use in music, where it's very quiet. And quiet refers to positional. We're just going to play very slow, very positional, not too many crazy tactics. We just develop good opening principles, and then we start stuff later. Now they play c3, pretty common so far. Of course, their idea is they're trying to prepare d4 and strike in the center. Very slow, very positional. And black will do the same. We play d6. We just want to get all of our pieces into play. We want to get castled, and then later we can start doing things. Of course, they castle as well. We castle. They play knight b to d2, all still opening theory here. And in line with opening theory, because I was still in theory at this point, I wanted to play pawn to a5, which is the move that I had studied. And I used to not play this move. I used to bring my bishop out pretty early, something like this, or maybe even go for the bishop here as a pin. But what ended up happening was I realized that maybe this isn't really to my play style, not to my liking, and very often they would get in d4, or in some lines they would get in b4, and then my bishop would come back, sometimes a4, and very shortly I was realizing I'd get my bishop trapped in a lot of lines. I don't want to have that. I just want to play a5 and just avoid everything. So b4 no longer comes, and if d4 ever does come, I can always retreat back to a7. So normal prophylaxis so far, everything is fine. They play a normal developing move, looks good. The engine actually prefers h3 just because of the possible bishop pin ideas that we had before, but that's not the only way to play. So now we'll get to the first critical position and the part with the doubled pawn becoming a major factor. I play bishop to e6, the idea I wanted before, not the only move, but a very playable one. And so why am I playing this? Because I'm allowing them to potentially capture here. And if they were to capture, I actually like this. Notice the computer does not like capturing. Why? It gives me doubled pawns, right? So shouldn't this be good for the opponent? Actually, no. This is a case where my doubled pawns, I want. I want this. This is a good thing. And when I was about 1600, is about the moment where I started realizing that something was up with these doubled pawns in this exact position. And I actually played that a little bit incorrectly until I was about 1800, and that's what I'm going to explain in this video. So basically what we have here is, yes, doubled pawns are weak in most situations because if we get to a pawn endgame, usually that is the decisive factor that is going to lose us a pawn endgame. We generally want better pawn structure. And of course, if your pawns are next to each other, like say here, then they can defend each other. If I have doubled pawns, this pawn here, as well as this pawn, can no longer get extra support from one of my pawns next to it. For example, how do I defend my e6 pawn? I don't have a pawn on f7, I don't have a pawn on d7, and I can no longer defend this pawn with another pawn. So automatically, this pawn becomes weaker and possibly a target in my position. So in this case, why is doubled pawns actually a good thing and not a bad thing, something that I allow? And the reason why is because here, everything is pros and cons in chess, and we do get a lot of play in exchange for having these doubled pawns. The very first thing, obvious to most people, comes to mind, is they get almost always a half-open file for the rook. If the rook isn't there, they can usually get a rook there. In this case, we have a rook here, so we have a half-open file, and so that's pretty good in exchange for having doubled pawns. What else do we have? Well, in this case, we also have the bishop here. And because the bishop and rook could coordinate on this square, I actually like having doubled pawns here. If this bishop was not on this diagonal here, I might not want doubled pawns because there's no guarantee that I'll have permanent play against f2. But because I already have 2 pieces potentially attacking that square, it justifies me opening up lines and having doubled pawns. Now, what else is there? Because there's one other very big factor here, and that has to do with what squares my pawns are controlling. In this case, both of these pawns are actually controlling some very valuable squares. I'll put them in a different color and show their importance here, because if we were to look at this position, maybe I'll put it in a different color here, because I don't like that color. It's kind of hard to see. Let's make it a blue. That way it doesn't blend in with the arrows. So here, I'll put it in blue color. These squares are actually very valuable. If we notice, like all of these here, the opponent's pieces could land on those squares. Let's take example d4 here. It's stopping them from advancing a pawn. That's going to help deter this pawn move to d4, something that we were worried about earlier. What about this square here? Well, this f4 square. Maybe long term they would want to push this pawn. Of course they can't do that because our bishop and that pawn is pinned, along this diagonal, but it is one more deterrent that they have against expanding on that side of the board. Now, what about the other squares here, namely f5 and d5? In a lot of lines, I'm sure many beginners have seen, they hop a knight into one of those squares with really deadly effect. If we look at d5, of course, there's many lines where they'll get a bishop here, and the bishop will be really annoying on our queen. And with that, oftentimes the knight will plop itself right down on d5, and then all of a sudden we have some problems on that square because there's too much pressure on our knight. We don't have that because our pawn, I'll just get rid of all the arrows here, our pawn here is actually controlling this square and keeping a knight out. And so we permanently have shut down all of those ideas. Now, in addition, remember how Garry Kasparov oftentimes got a knight to f5. This knight here, almost like a knife in our position, is really strong and a lot of power against our castled king. We also don't have to worry about that because now this pawn just defends this square. And so you can see we get a lot of bonus here because these pawns are controlling very key squares in the enemy position. So this actually justifies. Now, my opponent here actually knew this, I'm sure, or maybe they just had to study if they didn't know it, because they did not capture, they just played bishop to b5. And the computer likes it, computer says this is actually best, and the game continued and everything was fine out of the opening, but the importance here was focusing on the doubled pawns. Now, remember how I said that I incorrectly played this until I was about 1800? So what was my incorrect idea there? Because 1600 or so, I would allow the doubled pawns where I hadn't before, but until I was about 1800, I was playing it wrong. And so what I was doing incorrectly was I was thinking, oh, doubled pawn's not a big deal. And then later I would try and get rid of my weakness and say, well, I can always push here. And then if they ever trade, I can trade back. And voila, my pawn structure is fixed. I go into an endgame, no problems. But what I was not realizing, what is in many of those lines, when I undoubled my pawns, not only was I giving back control of these key squares we had earlier, but in addition to that, this pawn here often became very weak because when I advanced here and then we traded, notice what happened. This pawn now lost the support of my d pawn, the d6 pawn. And if that's not worse, notice how weak this pawn is because I don't have an f pawn, so I can't support it here like I traditionally would. And so my center actually became very weak in a lot of lines because I tried to trade off my doubled pawns, not realizing that they are actually a strength in this position and not a weakness. So that is a very key idea to have. But now, of course, examples are best. Let's bring it to another example and show that this is not just a one case, situation, that this actually happens in a lot of situations. So here's a little bit more of a recent game. And so here I'm on the black side once again. Our opponent is going to start with this London system type opening. Now, there's many move orders that you could have here to reach this. We do have the London system on the board. I play an early c5. They're going to play, of course, thematic London system moves. Everything good so far. And now I'm a little ambitious here and I want to play immediately on the queen side. I go queen b6. And all this is theory so far. My opponent knows this. They have to address this b2 pawn. And the main way to do that is to just simply block with the queen. So now we get to this critical position, which again is still opening theory. And it goes completely with what we were saying earlier about the doubled pawns. Because here, notice, I have the option of taking their queen and doubling their pawns. But I do not want to do that. Because if I trade here, trade queens, this move is not so great. And we'll let the engine run for a bit and we'll see how it shows. We see it's almost about half a pawn in white's favor just because I've traded. And now we'll see that the engine actually believes this is an inaccuracy. And what's going to happen is they'll take back and now they have the open file. So their rook is in really nice position here. It doesn't have to develop. It's perfect where it's at. And they have permanently the half open file here. And this rook is going to be very good against a7, which kind of ties down my rook to defense, or at the very least ties down my knight to defending this pawn. I don't really want to be defending this pawn. And so at the cost of doubling their pawns, white actually has a lot of activity in exchange for the having doubled pawns. Now, of course, to really hammer home the point, it's not just me taking. Notice what the very next move is. My opening prep goes with c4, and I actually do the exact same thing to them. Notice, I've given them, I'm daring them to take my queen. I want you to take. Please double my pawns. I want the doubled pawns. In this case, it's going to help me. And if they do take, then this is still opening theory, but now I have the half-open A file for my rook. And I have the exact same problem they have, where it's now inverse, right? Now their rook is tied down to defense of this pawn. And so I just have a doubled pawn, not a big deal, but the game continues. And I think they're going to have a lot of trouble trying to hold this despite my doubled pawn. Now, long term, because you might be wondering, is this weak going into the middle game and later endgame? No, because this pawn I can always trade off long term. In fact, a very common idea here is to just start advancing my pawn. I can start developing, yes, but I could also just play b5, b4, and if they ever trade, they just got rid of the weakness already. So they're probably not going to trade, but I have the option of exchanging this pawn off. So the fact that I've doubled pawns now isn't really that consequential because I have a lot of play for it, and long term I can always get rid of it well before we reach an endgame where that could be problematic. Back in this position, what should my opponent do? If they shouldn't trade queens, what should they do? Well, it's actually best to simply retreat the queen. And as my strong opponent knows, they retreat because they do not want to give me doubled pawns and give me the half-open A file. So here I continue developing with bishop f5. Now this is still a common opening trap here. You do not want to take this bishop. It is not a free piece because now I'll take b2 and all of a sudden the rook is lost. Now of course they know that. They don't hang this. And so they, of course, move the queen back, still defending this pawn, and the game continues. And everything is fine, but we'll end the analysis here because the doubled pawn moment is over, and we see that both sides chose to keep the queens on the board and did not want to double the pawns of the opponent. You have to look at it as an imbalance, and sometimes the doubled pawns are good, sometimes they're not. But you can't just make an immediate judgment call and say all doubled pawns are bad, because in many situations, like for example the Italian game one we had, I really want the doubled pawns because I have a lot of play for this and they control some very valuable key squares. So I hope this video helped everyone, and I'll see you in the next chess video.